our institutional structure that favors the two parties make it so that we only have a binary choice, and all of those independents or people who might actually want a third party, we have the Greens and the Libertarians are the biggest third parties. They really don't have a chance to win because of our system, the way we choose our representatives.
Good evening. I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, The Great Divide, Making Policy in Polarized Times. This is our third program in our 6-week spring program series, Governing in Crisis, Biden and the Looming Midterms. From charged school board meetings to shouting matches in Congress, on social media platforms and increasing partisan media outlets, the level of incivility and outright hostility to anyone with views opposed to one's own is alarming. Polarization in the United States has created both legislative stasis at the federal level and also widened the red state, blue state gulf, all contributing to a widespread lack of trust in democratic institutions by voters. How did we get here? And how can we dial down the divisions? How will this impact our democracy? President Joe Biden promised a return to civility in his inaugural address. Has he made any headway, or is this situation only worsening? We are so pleased that you have joined us this evening for this important conversation with policy experts in the field. The series is presented by Suffolk University's Department of Political Science and Legal Studies in collaboration with Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, the Washington Center, and GBH Forum Network. I'd also like to recognize the Lowell Institute, whose generous funding makes programs like this possible. This talk is being recorded by GBH's Forum Network and will be published on their website, and we'll share the links to these pages with you in the chat. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Christina Coolidge, a faculty member in Suffolk's Political Science and Legal Studies Department. Christina?
Thank you, Susan. It's great to be here tonight. I'm thrilled to have a really exciting panel, and I'm also very happy to have all of you back in the audience. So the topic that we're talking about tonight is particularly important in the democratic erosion literature. Polarization, dehumanization, the inability to play together in the sandbox all have impacts on our ability to make sound public policy, and also increasingly simply just to get along. And polarization in the United States is not simply a matter of partisan polarization. We are more divided than ever. We live with people in neighborhoods of people who are like us. We don't date people who have opposite or differing partisan views. We don't marry them either. So that, combined with bubbles of social media that tell us more of what we want to hear and confirm those biases, is very problematic. And it's at a point where I am concerned about the health of our democracy. So the question that we're going to be asking of our panelists tonight is, do they share my concern? And in what ways? And if so, how do we put on the brakes and reverse course from backsliding into a more healthy civil democracy? So I'm going to toss this to Arjun Singh, who is the Washington Post political producer. He is also an old friend of this series. So Arjun, welcome back.
Thank you, Dr. Coolidge. It's great to be back here at Suffolk and great to be speaking with all of you. I'm incredibly excited today to introduce my guest, Dr. Jennifer McCoy, former Congressman Scott Klug, and former Congressman Larry LaRocco, in what I think will be an incredibly insightful, but also very valuable conversation, particularly as we're speaking just hours before President Biden is going to be heading to Congress to give his State of the Union. Now, there's a lot of places that we can go with political polarization, but one thing that I think is obvious is that many of us, if not all of us here in the United States and around the world, are feeling it today, whether we're feeling it in our social circles, at the dinner table, Thanksgiving meals with our families. The tenor of the times seems to have reached a crescendo and a peak. But one thing that I'm very curious about personally, and I'd like to throw my first question to Dr. McCoy, is are we really experiencing a polarized moment when you look at it from a stepped back academic perspective? And Dr. McCoy, how do academics measure polarization? What metrics do we look at right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, Arjun. People ask a lot, haven't we been more polarized in the past? What about in the 1960s? Certainly, in 1968, we had political assassinations. We had huge protest over the Vietnam War. We had a lot of racial strife in the 60s. So yeah, that was a time of high division over a number of issues. Of course, you go back in time, we had in the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. And that's where we don't want to get, is where the divides get so rancorous that it turns into violence and into war. What I would say is the difference today is that our divides are lined up along partisan lines. In the past, it wasn't necessarily partisan divisions. So in the Civil War, it was more geographic, north-south, over questions of slavery. And in the 60s, it wasn't necessarily lined up along partisan divisions either. And a lot of it was generational. Today, because we have so many other identities that line up with our partisan identity. So we were just talking, there's a big rural-urban divide, and the Republican Party is extremely strong, and rural people, the majority of rural people are moving toward the Republican Party. Urban people who live in urban centers moving toward the Democratic Party. Racial identities are lining up more, religious identities are lining up more. And this means that the polarization impacts all those relationships that Christina was talking about in our social relationships, but also in Congress, where it's very hard for people from one party or another to cross the divide, to cross the aisle and actually build coalitions to work together on issues that they're interested in. That used to happen, even in the especially in the 1960s, it was happening. It is not happening today to the same degree. And what I'm concerned about is looking at our divide. There are many different ways to measure it. The one I'm concerned about is when we divide into two camps and we view each other with mutual distrust. And right now, Americans are seeing each other as a threat, that is, the two parties. 90% of Americans say that if Democrats say that if Republicans win, there will be harm to the nation. And 90% of Republicans say the same thing about Democrats. That's extremely high. And it's also, when you compare us to the rest of the world, extremely high for the advanced, very long established democracies. We are way above the rest of them.
Congressman LaRocco, when you hear some of the things Dr. McCoy talked about, in particular, the idea of a rural and urban divide, and the fact that a lot of Americans view the opposing party as a threat to the well-being of the country. You yourself were in Congress, and I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the district that you represented. And were these things that were applicable to you during your time in Congress? Did you feel that there was such a stark rural-urban divide, and did you feel that there was such a clash between the parties that people really did feel unsafe with the other party in power?
Well, it's an excellent question. I don't want to say things like in the good old days, when we sat around and drank whiskey together and it was all different. But in fact, in fact, it was different. It was before social media, actually, and my district is 500 miles long. It has 2 time zones, and north to south. And the 500 miles, there's a 2-lane road, and 62% of the district is owned by the federal government, and we're definitely inland. So, and under some measurements, it was one of the most rural districts in America, based on the cities under 25,000, for example. In those days, and sort of the good old days before Idaho became such a growth state and a destination for many people seeking maybe a more white environment type thing, politicians like myself would try and orient our messaging to independence. And so it was the bigger middle where I couldn't win with just Democrats. I had to win with moderate Republicans, and I had to win with independents. And a lot of people identified themselves as independents. And now we're finding that fewer people are identifying as independent. So it was different, but the messaging was also different. It wasn't instantaneous like it is now with social media. We didn't have what I would sort of call the hate industry of people that were trying to inflame passions, politicians that were more concerned about division rather than uniting. So it's a very different environment from the 90s. And I worry about it. I think the program was started with a sentiment that we're worried. I'm very worried about democracy and where it's going right now. It keeps me up at night, quite frankly, and I'm trying to figure out what I could do as an individual out in my state, where the divisions are quite stark. And I think we need to commit ourselves to doing something on a daily basis. But it's almost like technology has outrun our desires to deal with people individually. There's been the dehumanization that people have talked about, and certainly emotion, stereotypes, manufactured issues like critical race theory, the threats on the southern border and so forth are not helping at all.
Congressman Klug, you won multiple elections in a district as a Republican that had been longtime Democratic. It went Democratic after your time in office. When you look at your district today, do you think that you would still have been able to win as a Republican in your district? And can you talk a little bit about how your district had changed in the campaign that you ran and how you communicated to these traditionally Democratic voters that helped get you into office?
Well, I'm not sure when I ran it was quite as Democratic as people thought. So I beat a Democrat who'd been in for 32 years, but Madison and the surrounding area has been one of the fastest growing places in the US for the last 30 years. What happened was there was a city that was largely Democratic. An outlying area in the rural areas had always been staunchly Republican. And what had changed, Arjun, was the suburbs around Madison, which had become increasingly basically swing moderate voters. Madison's not unlike other parts of the country where red places become red and bluer places have become blue. And about the same time I was leaving, Wisconsin became more polarized. More people have moved into Madison, more people into Dane County. In fact, the second congressional district I used to represent is the fastest growing county in the district in the state of Wisconsin. And so it actually has to shed voters to the other outlying districts. What we're left with in Wisconsin now is a very blue Madison, a very blue Milwaukee, and then largely red across the rest of the state. So the sort of short answer is I doubt I could win simply because the politics I represented were premised on collaborating with the other party. That I thought, just because they were Democratic ideas didn't mean they were crazy ideas, in case sometimes they were very good ideas. And so people like Larry and I, or the problem solvers today in the US House, I think are very much convinced that they want to work together to get things done. The only caveat I will say is that for many Republicans, passing more legislation and setting up more programs is not necessarily being obstinate from a sense of the partisan divide. It's just Republicans like me don't necessarily want the federal government to have more power and more spending. So I think you've got to separate philosophical differences from what's a partisan harshness that didn't exist 15 years ago.
Do you think that the voters in your district when you were in office rewarded partisan loyalty to a party or getting things done? And I say that as I know that's a very generic sounding phrase, but did you feel there was a bigger emphasis that they wanted a congressman who represented the party and would fight for it in Congress, or a congressman who was able to come back to their district and say, here's X, Y, and Z, and I delivered on these things?
Well, I'm only laughing just because there weren't a lot of Republicans around Madison even when I ran. So it was a little bit of a shootout on a lifeboat. There was no like great Republican organization I had to fight my way through to get the nomination. In fact, a lot of Republicans had run for that seat and lost. And so I think at that point, it was really more of an indication of good government and who could best actually represent the district. So my wife and kids always stayed in Madison. I was home every weekend. And again, when I talk at community events, I'd acknowledge that oftentimes there were some ideas the Democrats had that were pretty good. So there was not a lot of party discipline. There still isn't. There are some quarters of Wisconsin that are like that. It will reflect that, I think, in the upcoming governor's race, which I think will be a good indication of where the state party is. The other thing which makes this sort of a weird thing is I had worked in local television for years, so people knew me. So there was a sort of a friendliness and comfort level that probably would not have existed in some other corners. The bad news is every time I stopped to get an ice cream with my kids, somebody was bending my ear. On the other hand, I didn't have to introduce who I was. And I think that helped me win the election and continue to win elections. So I was a little bit of an outlier.
What about you, Congressman LaRocco? Do you think that voters, when you were in office, would have preferred someone who delivers or someone who proudly stuck with the party regardless of the consequences?
Well, I always thought that you had to produce and you had to have an agenda that aligned with the state's needs and people's views. So a lot of my efforts were around public lands issues, and I sat on the Interior Committee, for example, but I always knew what some of the core issues were, for example, on guns and other things. So, that represented some of the values. Also, I'm a moderate Democrat, and life was easier, quite frankly, when George Bush was in. And in 1992, I actually ran 30 points ahead of Bill Clinton. And at that point, Ross Perot was a third-party candidate, and a lot of Idahoans sort of aligned with him. And he wanted to balance the budget. I wanted to balance the budget. So I took an approach for fiscal sanity, and I think people appreciated that. I also had a big holdover from the kind of campaign that I ran initially, which was where I took a job for a week at a time in every county in the congressional district. To my knowledge, I don't know of any other congressman or that's ever done it so deeply in a full immersion way like I did. So there was a lot of holdover, and people believed that I was in tune with their sentiments. I had to come home often, and it's farther away than Scott's district was from DC. I had to fly into two airports, Spokane and Boise. And when I was home, I wasn't really home because the district was so big. It's as big as Indiana. And with a 2-lane road that connected the north and south. So it was very tough. I won with less than 53% of the vote. So it was a swing district, and it meant that I had to work harder and work across the aisle. And I wanted to demonstrate that to my constituents. And it worked until we had a midterm election, and 54 of us lost in 1994. And at that point, it seems like the Democratic presence in Idaho, in terms of the bench that we had, sort of deteriorated, and then the growth started, and so the state turned demonstrably red. I guess I would say, too, that there's a big civil war going on, an ugly civil war in the Republican Party out in Idaho right now. So they're at war with each other, where they've marginalized the Democrats, actually.
Now, speaking of reaching across the aisle, did you and Congressman Klug ever have interactions with each other that you guys remember when you were both in Congress?
Well, yeah, actually, from the day we walked into Congress, we've been friends. We met each other in Boston, actually, at an orientation that was held at Harvard. And the most important part of that was not the policy knowledge that we took away from all the speakers. It was more what we were doing in the hallways and at night, socializing, getting to know each other. And we found that there was more to like about each other and agree with one another than divided us. And that was a very, very important element that started us off. And we've been friends ever since. We voted differently. We've had differences, but it's always been civil. But Scott and I have teamed up on many things where we want to talk to people about public service. We want to talk to them about civility. We want to talk to them about the role of democracy and in our country and how it fits into the overall structure of alliances with our friends abroad.
Now, I want to mention to the audience that we are taking questions from you guys, and we'll be taking those in throughout the evening tonight. So our first question that I want to raise is from Abby. And this is a question for you, Dr. McCoy. And she says that you had mentioned in something that you wrote that President Trump took advantage of something called negative partisanship during his campaign. And Abigail would like to know if you've seen a decrease in this negative partisanship since the January 6th insurrection, and what effect could negative partisanship have on the midterms?
Well, that's a way to measure, really, are people voting for someone or are they voting against their opponent? And what we've seen is a rise, general rise in the US, where people are voting, negative partisanship, as they've been voting more against them. And the feelings, what the surveys ask, how much do you dislike or like different candidates from your own party or others, or independents, they ask either one. And so what we're seeing is that it used to be that people liked their own party more than the other, but they didn't dislike the other to such a degree that would outweigh the like. Now we're seeing negative partisanship. It grows so that you're really influenced by the negative feelings you have by the other more than you are by the positive feelings you have for yourself. So I think that that's continuing. I haven't seen a direct measure since the January 6th insurrection, though, to see if that has changed.
Congressman Klug, one thing that is interesting to me about this moment is the use of things like censures by state Republican parties, disciplinarian measures, sometimes amongst members of the same party, for things such as going against the grain. And you saw that happening with Congresswoman Liz Cheney being rebuked by the party for saying that President Trump did have a role that should be investigated in the January 6th insurrection. You've seen that for people like Senator John Cassidy from Louisiana, censured for voting to impeach Donald Trump. When you were a Republican in Congress, was this ever something that would happen, that for simply going against what may be a popular belief within your party, you would risk something like a censure? And can you talk a little bit about what exactly these mechanisms are? What does it mean to be censured? Why is it such an important thing? And is there something significant that it is happening over just areas of disagreement, not necessarily over very egregious offenses?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything like that. I mean, both parties, I think, try to exert some kind of discipline over candidates, always have. I'm not really sure it's how successful it is. I mean, Lisa Murkowski turned it into a badge of honor and won the Alaska Senate race as an independent. And I regularly butted heads with my leadership. I don't think it ever came to the point of censure, but I'm not really sure there's that much discipline in a political party. I mean, unless they pull funding for your race, I don't really think it's that significant. And I think if you look at Liz Cheney, I think Liz Cheney's won it as a badge of honor too, trying to show her independence. So I think the proof will be in the pudding with the upcoming elections. If she loses because she's ended up in a very public fight with Donald Trump, or whether it helps her get reelected. I don't necessarily think that parties, from the outside, the parties may look like they have a lot of control. I'm really not sure what they can do to you. When I got in trouble, one time I refused to vote for Newt Gingrich as a speaker simply because the ethics investigation wasn't done. And I said, I'm going to vote president. I can't vote for you because you're not cleared. And I'm not going to vote against you because I don't know what the facts are. And at the end of the day, my punishment, I was banned from going to Republican National Committee dinners for the whole year, which I roundly applauded because it meant I didn't have to put on a tuxedo and sit at a bad table with people I didn't know. So I think it has more impact in the abstract than it really does from a practical basis.
You mentioned something very interesting that I think would be great for our students to hear more about, and that was the only real thing that could really threaten someone is if to yank funding from their congressional campaigns. Can you talk a little bit about the role of money in congressional politics and how that has evolved just in the time that you were in Congress, but from when you were serving to what you see today in 2022, the role of fundraising and where the parties can play in that? We hear that term a lot, but I think it'd be great to illuminate why is that such an important facet of politics today?
I think there's three levels of funding, right? There's the level of money you raise from individuals and supporters in your district. And in some cases, somebody in your district can represent a national organization like the National Restaurant Association. So you build from the bottom up with local support, and then that sometimes leads to national support. The parties also have the ability to direct money to you. The Republican National Committee, the National Republican Congressional Committee also have other sets of pots of cash that can apply. Larry can probably tell you about Idaho. Sometimes it was hard to pass the test and they won't send funding to local candidates. So not every state US Senate race gets equal amount of funding. They get funding based on what the political calculation is on the likelihood of winning that seat. I think what also has changed, though, is now the amount of money that goes in from Republicans against other Republicans, right? So it's sort of the pro-Trump crowd against the other card. And that's a dynamic that really didn't exist before. And the other thing is the force multiplier of that, because in the old days, all you could do was buy TV commercials, which are really expensive. Now you look at the sort of stuff you can do on social media and it's a nickel on the dollar. So your money can go a lot further. That's the thing that I think has changed. So you've got to convince folks you can win. It's a pretty cold-hearted world in politics. If they think you can win, you're going to get money. And if they don't think you can win, you won't get money. I didn't get very much money in my first race. But the difference now is sometimes you have to play defense too, not only against attacks from Democrats, but attacks from other Republicans. So I think that's a whole new layer of complication for candidates that didn't exist in my day and age.
And Congressman LaRocco, I want to take this question from RJ in the audience because I think it's a good follow-up to what Congressman Klug was talking about. But RJ wants to know that Montana Senator Jon Tester, who is a Democrat, has said that the Democratic Party's brand in rural America is toxic. What would you recommend for Democrats who are trying to rebuild the brand or do outreach to people in rural America? Or do you think that rural America is lost to Republicans and Democrats have just lost this track on messaging?
Well, I think Senator Tester is onto something. His book, Grounded, is a really good book about how a rural politician has been in touch and won. And it amounted to doing a lot of work for veterans, going home every weekend and farming his own ground and also doing work for agriculture and just being home. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, and I think that's what we're coming back to, is that you have to have an agenda that people know about, identify with, and that you can deliver on. The challenge for him gets back to what Scott was just saying, is that he comes from a rural state, doesn't cost much to run there, but if your opponents, and I mean that in a plural sense, are going to spend $20 million or $30 million in rural Montana, the amount of dollars spent per voter is astronomical. So that means that he has to raise the money defensively. So we're going through an exercise, quite frankly, in Idaho, where the Democrats are trying to figure out how to brand themselves and articulate their values and sort of shoot down how oppositions have branded us. And there's two ways to do things in politics. You either brand yourself and define yourself, or you define your opponent. And this is what you have to do. You have to be on the offense. And you don't want to play defense. And there's a saying that when you're explaining, you're losing. So Tester is a perfect example of that. But he goes home often and he has a certain profile. And he's unique in that. I think he's a great politician, a great guy. And he's good for the United States Senate, by the way. But he also has to raise a lot of money. These issues exist on the funding side. Quite frankly, I don't like leadership PACs. If I were king, I would outlaw leadership PACs because I think it gives politicians another bite at the apple, and it's acting too much like a slush fund. I would do away with Citizens United, which is now part of the landscape since Scott and I were in Congress, and there's just a lot of money, and we need more transparency, quite frankly, and where the funds are coming from. But both sides are using dark money sources now, and you just don't know where the money is coming from and who's on whose side. I was in Arizona recently, and everybody's on the airwaves already there. And tonight, just so we're all in sync, Texas is going to sort of fire the first shot, if you will, on the primaries. Both the Republicans and the Democrats are going to be looking at what happens out in Texas, whether the progressives are going to win and whether the far right is going to win in knocking off incumbents.
Dr. McCoy, as we're talking about what's happening in our system, the reasons that certain things happening, I would love for you to discuss a little bit of one of the studies and an analysis you did of different democracies, and you used a term called pernicious polarization. Could I just start by asking you to explain what is pernicious polarization, and are we experiencing that in the US, and what other countries would share that same grouping?
Yeah, we are experiencing it. That is where I define polarization as when a process where politics gets more and more simplified. And so normal politics, as the congressmen have talked about, you have to differentiate your parties. You want to show the differences that you have on different issue positions. But when we get to the point that people are divided, as I was describing earlier, into these two camps, they're lining up so that the issues they believe are the same and other kinds of identities are the same, and they're feeling hostile toward the other side. So it's this distrust. When it gets to the pernicious level, that is polarization that's gotten so deep. And the language, the demonization, the discrediting of the opponents usually comes out. And it's the reason I call it pernicious is it's pernicious consequences for democracy. So the US is the only country, I would say, at that level among the advanced, really liberal democracies in the world, what we think of as the Western democracies. So Japan, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. But the other countries that are as divided as we are would include democracies that are a little bit less well developed. They're often called electoral democracies in political science. And they would include Brazil, India, and countries that are losing their democratic character. They're getting more and more toward the autocratic line, like Hungary, Turkey. These are countries that are extremely divided, like the United States. And that's why I'm concerned about this effect on our democracy and the really pernicious consequences and the fragility of our democracy at this moment.
Is there a remedy to this pernicious polarization in a system that really rewards and somewhat locks out anything but two major political parties?
Yeah, there are several parts to the remedy because it's a very complex problem. The campaign finance, for example, that we were just talking about is a major part of it as well. Social media and the way social media works is a major part of it. But our institutional structure that favors the two parties make it so that we only have a binary choice, and all of those independents or people who might actually want a third party, we have the Greens and the Libertarians are the biggest third parties. They really don't have a chance to win because of our system, the way we choose our representatives. So I would really like to change that to allow for more choice, allow other parties to emerge or candidates to represent other issues. And so there are some alternatives that could do that. Ranked choice voting is one. Sometimes it's called instant runoff, but you actually get to rank several of your choices so that we would end up with a candidate that has more support across the board. More people would like that candidate as their second choice. So even if they don't get their first choice, that's going to bring more consensus toward candidates. It's going to bring them back to the center because they have to appeal to a broader audience. Right now, we can appeal to the extremes because we're going, especially because of our primary system, that we go to the extreme. So a great example is right now in Massachusetts. It's a very deep blue state, but they have many times a Republican governor. And there's a very popular Republican governor there right now who's decided not to run again, mostly because he's going to be primaried on the right. And since only Republicans vote in that, the fear is that the more right-wing candidate will win that primary. He has been popular and had support, especially from independents as well. So he could reach across and has high approval ratings among Democrats. But that is increasingly rare in our system. So changing the way we elect people and also moving away from single member districts. We are one of only 3 major democracies out of 26 major democracies. Only 3 have purely single member districts like we do, and just, without this ranked choice voting method. So if we could change and have multi-member districts, so within a state, voting for your state legislature, you might vote for a district, that might have 5 people. And that way, some other smaller parties might have a voice, or you wouldn't have, Republicans in a really blue area feeling unrepresented because they could never get, a Republican in party, and vice versa.
I'd love to hear from you, both congressmen, about some of those reforms. I'll start with you, Congressman Klug. Particularly, what would you make of implementing something like ranked choice voting and having a multi-member district? Do you think that would have reduced the polarization that we're seeing today, and even polarization that may have existed in the 90s when you were in Congress?
Well, if the supposition is you want to improve the system so more things get done, I think it just makes it more confusing, right? So if you now double the membership of the House of Representatives to 900, roughly, then you've got to develop an even broader coalition if you've got 17 splinter parties that exist in multiple states. It sounds to me like the Italian legislature where they've got so many fractured stuff. I'm not sure that makes you more efficient by doubling the number of people who are there and having different small splitter parties, because then you're going to have to reach out to build coalitions across all those. And in ranked voting, there was just a major analysis done that I was talking about Dr. McCoy with before we got on, that said in a ranked system, actually, if you look at it from an analytical and mathematical perspective, it tends to favor the candidate who comes in third. That's just sort of the way it's played out. So I'm not necessarily sure you get your second choice. You may get a third choice who may not be a good alternative at all. I'm not really sure those structural reforms are the major issue. I think there's a few things in play here. Back to Dr. McCoy's point about the 60s being less polarized. One of the things, as you said, is because Congress was much more successful. Well, it was a Democratic House and Senate that controlled most of Congress throughout the 60s. And so, of course, it was easy to do it because they had vast majorities, which is how Johnson was able to pass all the Great Society programs. And then secondly, I think the more serious problem, and from my view, the most pernicious problem is the internet. I mean, I'm not sure how you put the genie back in the bottle, but it's led to tribal warfare. It's allowed anonymity where people can attack you from 10,000 miles away. Unfortunately, the arrival of the internet also, I think, has had a tough influence on the press corps. I mean, I went to Northwestern. I had lots of buddies who worked at the LA Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer and papers East, Northwest, and South. And the newspaper business has changed. So now it becomes, in many ways, a click battle. And the click battles led to a domination of opinion pages, even the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's going to be interesting now about the transition at CNN, because the new owners of CNN came out of Discovery who said they want much more objective press coverage on CNN and far little opinion things. It'll be interesting to see how that battle plays out and what the impact actually is on CNN's viewing. Larry and I were talking earlier today. I flew on a flight yesterday from Detroit to Boston, and I was finishing up watching an Amazon Prime movie, but the guy to my right was watching the Ukraine coverage on Fox, and the guy to his right was watching the Ukraine coverage on MSNBC. And I think it's that dividing us into sectors that makes it so different. And I think both demographic trends and the current structure of the internet and the media are much more serious problems than rank voting.
Congressman LaRocco, I have a question I want to throw to you, but Dr. McCoy, I just want to give you a chance. Was there anything you wanted to respond to that
Yes.
with, or introduce some different perspective?
Yeah, sure. The point of ranked choice voting is to allow people to have more consensus. So people who are getting more second, even third choices votes in their ranking are going to have more consensus across the board. And it really depends on, I have to analyze the study that you're talking about. I have not seen that kind of analysis that shows that, because it really depends on how many people are running and how extreme it is. Second, I would just say that I do think the House of Representatives should be enlarged somewhat, but ranked choice voting, multi-member districts has nothing to do with whether you double Congress or not. It doesn't imply that you need that at all. You can keep it the same size that it currently is and use those methods. And third, what I was pointing out, you're absolutely right about the 1960s, when the Democrats had a large majority, they could pass things. What we've seen now in the last 15 years, when both parties have had majorities, they also have not been able to pass them. So under Donald Trump, Republicans could not repeal the ACA healthcare, which they had been running on for 10 years, because they had to rely on having consensus within their own party. Same for Democrats. They can't pass now the Build Back Better. In the past and in the 60s for civil rights, people did vote across the aisle. And so if you didn't have your full party, because there was more diversity within the party, you could still get allies from the other party. Today, we don't do that. It's almost, so many of the votes, except for a major crisis, let's say, at the beginning of the pandemic, so many of the votes are divided along party lines. And that's really the difference. You don't have that possibility of building those coalitions across the aisle. That's what I think is so dysfunctional about our current system.
If I could just make one note.
Yep, absolutely.
I disagree with your supposition. You're assuming that if Congress acts and passes more programs, it's a good thing. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm a believer in small and more limited government. So standing up to that conclusion you draw, I think is wrong. I mean, in my opinion, Republicans blocking programs are doing exactly what they said they do because they don't want a larger government. So I don't necessarily know your argument follows a logical conclusion that would say Republicans should be more like Democrats and vote for more programs.
And on that note, I think let's bring in some of our student speakers and questioners today. So first up, I'd like to bring in Olivia Catan. She's a student here at Suffolk. Olivia, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun. I would first like to thank the panel for being here today, but my question is for Dr. McCoy. As previously discussed in your latest article, What Happens When Democracies Become Perniciously Polarized, you discuss the us versus them mindset and how individuals divide themselves into mutually exclusive political camps. So what tools would you recommend to younger voters like me to open a mindset to students who are inundated with polarized media?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one because media, as the congressman was saying earlier, both traditional media and social media are so polarized. It's like we're living in two virtual worlds. So I think that the most important thing that we can do as individuals is to be curious and to approach other people to try to understand what's underlying their, what are their motivations for the views that they have. And really try to understand what are their values, what are the things that they're really concerned about that might lead to their views. And what I think we would find if we do that, if we take the time to do that, is that we actually share a lot of the same values. And it's just maybe the way we want to get there, or the assumptions we make about the other person are wrong, distorted assumptions. And if we spend the time to try to learn about it, we can get around the clickbait of social media. So just in the exchange that we just had now with former Congressman Klug, I would have answered, if we'd keep going, yeah, I understand you're concerned about passing more spending programs, but Congress doesn't just, the legislation isn't all about spending. And, a lot of things there's, mutual interest in. Usually defense spending gets a lot of bipartisanship. So, if we go further and really explore that, then I think we can find common ground on our values, but maybe differences on how to get there. And the other thing I would really suggest is to be really careful about the social media and the clickbait. And that the way the model is, the profit model now of our media generally, and particularly of social media, are the algorithms that draw on the psychology of human beings, that we're going to click on things that make us afraid and angry, not things that give us hope and are positive messages. We're afraid. If we're afraid or if we're angry, we're going to click on those. And so it gets worse and worse. And we move into disinformation so easily, and then we can, move into conspiracy theories. So being very careful about watching what it is that you're sharing and clicking on is really critical, and pushing to change. I would also like to see a big change in the business model of our social media that plays on psychology of individuals in a very harmful way for our democracy.
Great. Thank you, Olivia, very much. Next up, we have Shannon Kelly, who is also a student here at Suffolk.
Thank you, Arjun. My question is for former Congressman Scott Klug. Sometimes legislators must choose between voting for their constituents' needs while upsetting party leaders, or vice versa. Were you ever faced with that situation during your time in Congress? If so, what factors did you take into consideration when making the choice between constituent needs or party leadership? Also, what criterion did you use to weigh the two options?
I think you're probably making it much more analytical than my thought process was. I think given the choice, Larry would say the same thing I do. You always vote for your constituents. I think you're paid to represent your district. That's what your job is. It's one of the reasons I think living back in your district, if possible, for members of Congress is important, because you'll get direct feedback on things. I think the only case I can think of where it was a tough call in terms of what my constituents wanted me to do and what I thought was the right thing is when Larry and I were both first elected, the vote, our first week was over Desert Storm. And in Madison, which had been a center of the anti-war movement, along with Berkeley and along with, Cambridge in the 60s, it was sort of a tough call politically about which way it would go. And so I promised the Republican leadership when they told me I didn't have to vote that way because they had the votes, that assuredly at some point in the future, I'll be on the opposite side of you. But I think when it comes to war and comes to military action, you've just got to make the tough decision and swallow. But I think always, you always hear about lobbyists will do this and the other members will do that and leadership will do that to you. The best way to assure that you get back around is to make sure you've got a true read on your district and vote what your constituents want you to do.
Congressman LaRocco, what about you?
Well, there were some tough votes. The one that Scott mentioned, I voted my conscience on Desert Storm. I served in the Army during the Vietnam War, and I saw us mired down in Southeast Asia, and I didn't want to see us get mired down in the Middle East. I voted for more diplomacy and more sanctions. I really didn't know where that was going to go, so it was a vote of conscience. And also, there was a bill on the assault rifle ban, and a lot of Democrats wanted to vote for that. I opposed it, and the bill had a lot of good things in there for policing and so forth. But I was just hearing a lot from my constituents on that. I did propose a wilderness bill when a lot of my timber-dependent communities were just scared about their jobs. In the final analysis, I really wasn't able to convince them that what I was doing was going to cost them their jobs, but they had it in their mind that more federal intrusion and designation of forested lands as wilderness was going to cost them. So I tried to show some leadership on that and show that certainty was going to actually benefit them, but I had a tough time on that. On a couple of other things that have been said, I just want to comment that I think ranked choice voting would be a good experiment. Out in Idaho, the Republican Party has actually instituted a closed primary, which is really an effort to purge the party of moderate Republicans. And so that's led to a bit of the civil war out there in my state. And I think it's unfortunate, but it's happening. And also, I think in terms of partisanship, occasionally you see these gangs of 6, 8, or 12, something like that, where an equal number of members from the Senate will get together and try and really override their leadership. I think we need more of that, both in the Senate and the House. And when you look at the agenda and branding and the goals of a certain party, I'm just reminded that the Republicans at their convention in 2020 didn't even pass, a blueprint what they were going to do. Minority Leader McConnell recently said, "We'll see what we'll do when we're in the majority." So they haven't really revealed what their program is, except to oppose what Biden is doing. And I think we need a little bit more of an agenda, and so that people know where the parties are going, but that's the way it is today in a polarized world.
Next up, I wanted to bring in Joshua Reed, who's also a student here at Suffolk. Joshua, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun, for the introduction. I would also like to thank everyone involved with putting this series together. My question is for Congressman LaRocco. So we've seen various pieces of legislation with broad support among voters fail to be enacted. Most recently, we've seen the Build Back Better bill fail, despite many of its provisions having support from a plurality of voters. Should there be more of a discussion on national ballot initiatives to bypass congressional gridlock and partisanship?
Well, Build Back Better is very aggressive. If you look at sort of the history of the development of the legislation, Sanders claims that it started at $6 billion, which was sort of a negotiating tool because he knew that that was never going to fly. So then it went to $4 billion, and then Manchin showed up on the scene with Senator Sinema. Now we're down to $2 billion, and now it's just not even happening. I think what's going on in Congress right now is that the president is, leading as if he's FDR and he's got a huge majority. I think things have to be symmetrical, if you will. I mean, we have a divided Senate, and so you have 50-50. So I think the Democrats need to get together and decide what they can do. Already they passed the infrastructure bill, which is terrific because President Trump talked about an infrastructure bill for 4 years and never got it done. And so the Democrats were able to do that, but they haven't been able to talk about it, what it's going to mean for jobs and the economy and so forth, because they tried to move on to Build Back Better. And then it became sort of a dumping ground and like a Christmas tree, and it had everything on it. And there are some good things in there, and my progressive friends would not like me saying that certain things might have to be axed, but in a sense, sometimes you have to legislate in terms of incrementalism rather than trying to do wholesale things and have good ideas that you get nothing done. So here we are in the second year of the Biden presidency, and it's looking like the Democrats are divided instead of coming together and doing what was possible. So I think they kind of miss things, and as James Carville have said, I think the Democrats need to go into woke rehab. And, we need to talk the language that people are talking out in America and not sound like we're preaching to people and that we know it all. And so I think getting back to John Tester, I think we need more people like John Tester that can talk to Americans about what's going on.
Great. We've only got a couple minutes left, so I wanted to bring on our final student speaker, and that is Iman Amour. Welcome.
Thank you, Arjun, and allow me to thank our distinguished panel and the organizer for this very insightful discussion. My question is actually to you, Arjun. Today, polarization is a global phenomenon. According to Bloomberg, polarization is intensifying misinformation and might be threatening democratic institutions. As a politic producer, and what is the role of social media today to limit partisan polarization, and what are your recommendations in regards of safeguard to save democracy and reduce social division?
Yes, that's I think that's a phenomenal question. It's something we in the media certainly grapple with a lot. And what I would say is that there's a lot of discussions about potentially putting limits or punishments for social media companies. And to me, that opens a big Pandora's box of, social media companies. I grew up in Silicon Valley. My dad's a software engineer out there. Social media companies are run by engineers, business people, good lawyers who are trying to protect their companies. They're not the kinds of people who sit and have grand debates and discussions on what are the limits of speech, what constitutes violent speech. So I would first say that I tend to not look as much on hoping that Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey at Twitter or whoever the new CEO is now, find a good benevolent solution. I think the most important thing that we should be talking about, though, is educating our population in media literacy and understanding that bias does exist even at places like where I work, the Washington Post, a legacy newspaper. And as much as we try to uphold objectivity, I think everyone who's here on the panel today can tell you it's very difficult to separate yourself every single time from emotional events, matters of war and peace, taxation, people's lives. It's difficult to just always step out. And so the first is understanding that biases do exist. The decision to run certain stories, frame certain stories, they come in with biases. And the more that we can educate people beginning in schools and from a young age, to be able to figure out, well, this story was framed a certain way, it talked about certain things, I should try and find another story that presents more information. But what we see a lot today, rather, is to immediately take a piece of information, and if it puts things in there that we don't necessarily like to hear or we didn't want to hear, there's a tendency to just cast it away, because you can find a media source. Like Congressman Klug was saying earlier today, if you have a certain opinion on Ukraine, you can find one of many cable news talk show hosts who will find your exact thing, say the exact things that you want. But that's not what we need. We need to be told things that we don't want to hear. We need to be confronted with ideas that we don't particularly like. And we need to also get back to a model where journalism, to me, is getting back to just writing the facts, less opinion columns, less things that will make people angry and click on, more just straight reporting. I would love personally if in political reporting, we talked more about what these two gentlemen did on their committees rather than what perhaps people write on their social media accounts or tweet out. And the media, I think, can definitely take responsibility. But when you specifically asked about social media, I know this is not the most fun thing to say, but social media exists mostly as a form of entertainment and to market things to people. It's not a primary place that you should get news. It's a good source. There's absolutely value in hearing things on the ground. But I would just give as a piece of advice to everybody, it does take time to become media literate. It takes a lot of time to learn about issues. And I think, everybody here on the panel can agree with that, whether it was the two congressmen on their committees staying up late nights to read bills and understand what they would do. Dr. McCoy dedicating her career to understanding this. We have to put in work to understand ourselves and our neighbors, our society, and our country. And it's not going to be distilled down to 280 characters or whatever Twitter's character count is now. It's not going to be a 2-minute video on Facebook that explains everything to you. Knowledge takes time and it takes effort, but I think that if we are willing to put in that effort and not look for shortcuts and easy solutions to be informed, we will be a better society. And I think the media has a role to play in not fomenting the polarization that we're seeing right now and really trying to act as a backstop towards it. And they can maybe stop with all these headlines of the country's in a civil war and it's never going to get back. So that is my 2 cents right there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much to our panelists for speaking here. We have a little bit of time at the end if we can continue, if you guys are up for taking a couple questions. I guess what I would want to know is, now that I just spoke about the media, is what role did the media play in creating division in Congress when you two were there? But Dr. McCoy, I'll start with you first. What role does the media play today in your mind in this pernicious polarization, if any at all?
I think it exacerbates it a lot, particularly the social media that we were talking about, because of this model of really fomenting outrage politics, but also, cable news, traditional media, as well. Part of it is, so for example, in your paper, I think, journalists focusing on what Congress is doing, and they focus on, is this legislation a win for the Democrats or the Republicans? It's winning. Who's winning? Meaning somebody's losing, rather than the content of the legislation, as we were talking about before. Some of the policies, the programs within Build Back Better are very popular. And so rather than talking about the content and how that's going to affect people, the reporting is on, this is a win for this party or a loss for that party or that president. So I think changing that kind of framing would help, and help with the information of people, instead of just saying my party won or lost, so I'm going to be angry at this or, positive about this. It's not the cause of polarization, but it exacerbates it. Definitely, the polarization within the media is exacerbating, and a lot of it has to do with technological change, financial models, etc. Is the rise of this change in the media, but it's definitely making it worse and harder to overcome. Not even to mention the intentional disinformation campaigns coming from inside our country and outside our country, affecting our democracy.
If I may, I would like to follow on the model that Dr. McCoy just mentioned. And just for my own state of Idaho, we basically have a news desert out in Idaho, based on the publishing model that has shrunk the newsrooms, and we just don't have many people covering things. And various nonprofits are providing some news services out there, but basically we don't have enough coverage. So that's a real issue for us out in Idaho, and I suspect in other parts of the country. So it's just something to focus on, and I believe it's hurting us quite a bit.
Congressman Klug, you have an interesting position because you were both within the news and you were within politics. How did your experience working in media shape your perspective of being in politics?
So I'm sorry, which way? So was I a journalist? What was I surprised about in politics, or vice versa?
No, how did what you learned in media, how did that influence your perspective on politics? Do you feel like it was a helpful background coming into politics? What did you learn in media that you took with you going into politics?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that serve you well in media that served me in my career in politics. The one thing you'll appreciate, and anybody who's been in journalism, is you have to be a quick study, right? And for Larry and I and other members of Congress, there's so many things coming at you so fast. You've really got to be able to keep 68 balls in the air at any given time. So I don't know if that's a skill I had going into journalism, or journalism forced me to do that. The second thing you understand, I think clearly, is your ability to communicate with your constituents and a strategy to communicate in such a way. I thought the press did a pretty fair job covering me most of the time. The only thing that I would get frustrated by was sort of an assumption of guilt. So if I raised money and voted for a trade bill, I was in the pocket of industry because I took campaign contributions from them. Where in the contrast, it might be that people supported me because I was pro-business. And similarly with Larry, do you make the argument to say, well, he's in the pocket of the AFL-CIO because they gave him money. That's why he voted against that trade bill. So I think that presumption of guilt sort of always drove me crazy. Everybody would impugn your motivations. But other than that, I thought the press for the most part was pretty fair and did a pretty good job. And I still do. But, you raised a point that I think is awfully important that gets lost in these conversations about the press. When I argue with my friends who are former Northwestern journalism students with me, it's an argument not necessarily about the facts that are in the New York Times or a Washington Post story. I think the reporters are as straight as they've ever been. It's the angle of the story going in. It's what the editors decide to do. That's what really reflects it. I mean, the first time the New York Times does a story that says, here's a government program that should be cut to death, I mean, I'll drive to New York and buy the whole newsroom flowers and chocolate. It's the sort of presumption. And so I've gotten to the point now where I think sort of the New York Times represents sort of and I don't mean this in a weird way, like the East Coast intelligentsia. I think the Washington Post is a government town newspaper, and the Wall Street Journal is sort of the big business view of how the world works. So I think when you read all three of those, and I'd throw the BBC TV coverage into that, I think you get a nuanced view of the world. But if you don't do that, it's awfully hard to get a balanced view. I mean, sometimes you read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times editorial pages, and it's like, where are both of these worlds? It's got nothing to do with me, but that's just my perception.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's, really at the heart of what I was trying to get to the students, which is understand that the different papers, different editors have their own sort of biases that they'll come in with. But I want to now take you to one sort of wrap-up question for each of you. And I know we've talked about what can feel like a very big moment of despair, but Dr. McCoy, let me start with you. What is the pathway forward? Is there a means for us as a population, if we're feeling frustrated that our government is polarized, it's not reflective, how would you suggest moving forward with this? And I'll give you any sort of a perfect world answer. You don't have to necessarily constrain it to if X and Y and Z will get passed. So you're welcome to go anywhere you want with this.
I think the most important thing is to stay engaged. Don't turn off from society, from politics, and remain engaged, and decide what kind of reform you think could be helpful and go for it. Or even run for office, even though it seems to me like it's a pretty awful kind of job to have right now. The more different points of view, and especially the more we can get younger people into office, I think that's really important. We have kind of a big generational gap here in politics and in Washington. So that's the most important, is to remain engaged. As I said, reach out, try to understand other points of view and see where you can find any common ground. I do think that, the structural reforms are necessary. I think that there's the biggest challenge for the US in particular, compared to some of our other democracies, is that we are changing, for a wealthy country, our demographics are changing faster than most of the other wealthy democracies. And that's very difficult for people to deal with, I think. But we've got to figure out how to be a multiracial and multicultural democracy that we are. And that's scary to a lot of people when we start seeing things and they think that their own values are going to be changed or, attacked. But we've got to figure this out, because this is also underlying a lot of the division in our society. And that's where I have a lot of hope in young people, because I think generally there's a great, different experiences and a great deal of tolerance among the younger generations, and less fear of change, perhaps, that will enable us to look for creative solutions and to allow for this diversity. So that's my hope. That's what gives me hope. And so I really want to just give a call for action to the students in this broadcast to stay engaged, keep your interest, keep seeking out information, seeking out points of view, but then go and do what you think needs to happen to change.
What about you, Congressman LaRocco?
I would say I agree with so much of what Dr. McCoy said, but I think students have to accept their role as citizens, and they have to embrace the country, understand the fragility of our democracy. And in a sense, speaking about today's world, I think we have to embrace and channel the feelings of the Ukrainians. I think that they're fighting for their country, and I think we need to I don't want to really say fight for our country, but in a sense we have to, because our democracy is really at stake here. And I love the engagement at any level. I think it epitomized what was going on in 2018 in the midterm elections, where people just said, I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. I have to do something. I have to work for a candidate, or I have to be a candidate. And that's at all levels. And we have to understand that our democracy is propped up not necessarily by words in the Constitution, it's propped up by norms. And the sideboards are what we've done and accepted over the more than 2 centuries of our existence. And those norms are being eroded, and the hate industry that involves the social media is corrosive to our democracy. And we have to value this, because we're in dangerous times right now, not just because of what's going on in Eastern Europe, but because of what's happening domestically. And I think we have to reach out to one another and do a lot of what we've talked about tonight, is understand where the other person's coming from, and be open-minded, and not think that our positions should have 100% validity. We have to be willing to speak to other people.
What about you, Congressman Klug?
Well, let me say that I think if you look at some recent studies that have been done, I think you'll find Republicans much more optimistic about the future of democracy than the Democrats are. There's, I think, a fixation on January 6th, rightfully so, but it's not the beginning and the end of the American experience. And I think people are ready to move on from it. I also don't necessarily agree with the supposition that demographics are destiny. One of the races to watch tonight in South Texas in the primaries is the increasing move of Hispanics in South Texas to become Republicans, not Democrats. So I think there's lots of trends going both ways. I guess I'd end on a more optimistic note, and that we managed to survive the Civil War, the Depression, World War II, lots of other things. We'll survive this. The country's pretty strong and far more resilient than I think many people give it credit for.
Well, I want to thank all 3 of you again for joining us tonight. And it was an honor to be back with you guys here at Suffolk. So if you're watching the State of the Union tonight, I hope that you find it informative. You feel like you're a part of history. But if you're watching the Celtics game tonight, you can't really blame you. And I will throw it back to Professor Coolidge.
It's Christina Arjun, and I'm so glad you're back with us. This was a wonderful conversation. I want to give a couple of shout outs to the Association of Former Members of Congress, the Congress to Campus program. We actually have former Congressman Klug and LaRocco held hostage, and we are marching them through several days, and they've been troopers. And also a shout out to the Democratic Erosion collaboration, to which both Jennifer and I belong. So thank you for raising all of these questions, for providing some insight, and for ending on a glasses half full note with a call to action. The only thing that I would add is that it's not just for students. I mean, they're really important, but the rest of us who remember the pre-social media era need also to be on board. So thank you to our audience. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our students. And I hope you will all tune in to our next episode, which will examine climate change and where President Biden's agenda is there. From the title, you can see we've already made a judgment call, but we're open to persuasion, which is exactly what you all modeled tonight. So, Congressman, go to the Celtics game. And Jennifer, thank you so much for tuning in from Budapest. It's late. Go to bed.
Really, get some sleep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
It was quite enjoyable.